Here we go. We got it. Yeah.
So it's just going to be tap that button over here to mute it, and the light will turn orange.
Okay.
You're not going to be seen unless you go up on stage, because I've only got that.
Okay. I got a face for radio.
Just be the voice from the great beyond.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. My name is Matt Zimmerman. I'm chair of the history department, and on behalf of the history department, I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker today. Our speaker, I'm told, toots his own horn very well, so I will keep my comments very brief. Father Mayer comes to us from Marquette University. He has previously served in various capacities. He's been a professor, a department chair, and I believe a dean as well. He is a widely published scholar. He is a member of the New Society of Jesus, a Jesuit, and holds a PhD in history. He's a very engaging gentleman, a very engaging scholar, and today he will be talking to us about religious imagery in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and as well as a bit about how the Tolkien archives ended up at Marquette. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Father Mayer.
No, I think, yep, got it now. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, and it is a real privilege. I love coming here to different universities because I really feel that universities throughout the United States, and especially in Europe, there's a real collegiality as we all bring to young people and to learners of different ages the things that we value. So thank you for this opportunity. So, good afternoon, and my thanks for welcoming me to Macon. Thanks to go to those who encouraged this talk, since any mention of religion, unless it's thoroughly condemned as useless, has little hearing these days in the academia. And this is not only a pity, but a deprivation for our students. Religious thought is a part of the human tradition, and so often we make the mistake of presuming conversation about religion identifies us either as an advocate or an adherent. Well-informed conversation about religion deepens our awareness of the human experience, and it is not surprising an avoidance of religion has become paired with a decrease in the humanities. A world without the beauty of the humanities, particularly the literature generated by religious experience, is a world for orcs and the teeming horde from Mordor. This is not to say there is no place for science, but science without governance of divine inspiration usually cascades into a lust of power for its own sake. The examination of J.R.R. Tolkien's rich imagery, both literal and visual, has become a sort of cottage industry. Little figures from Burger King. But unfortunately, the interest has decreased as the fascination for his work and the movie now are almost 10 years old. And it has become less a fad and more the reserves of medievalists, theologians, and people who like to dress like elves. Tolkien's imagery is a large subject. To address the subject, I would like to do what Caesar did to Gaul and to divide the matter into three parts. For those of you who did not take Latin, Caesar in his famous Gallic wars divided Gaul up three ways, omnia divisis in partes tres. Jesuits like to divide things up into threes, following good rhetorical method, and that way you know when the plane is going to land and you can go home. First, I would like to explain why Marquette University, the land of brats, I would like to explain why Marquette University, Milwaukee, the land of brats on a bun, Brewer baseball, is the repository of manuscripts describing Bilbo Baggins. Second, a short bit of information on an upcoming exhibition at Marquette University on Tolkien's drawings and watercolors. And third, the main part of my talk, I would like to offer some insights concerning Tolkien and his drawings and paintings that may give you a deeper insight into the visual works of the master. So why am I here? The answer is simple. I was threatened to be cudgeled with a chicken leg by Carol Melton. And if I did not come to Tolka to Macon and share my insights, young students, if Carol Melton ever threatens you with a chicken leg, you run, because that woman means business. So, why Marquette? So how did Marquette University obtain the manuscripts in related manner for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? Okay, there I am. And I'm saying, in 1952, Marquette University, a Jesuit and Catholic university in Milwaukee, broke ground for a new library, an expansion required in light of the post-war changes that occurred in the academic community. The late 1940s and into the 1950s witnessed a tremendous change for education in general, and especially for Catholic education, which generated the need for more buildings and increased faculty. In 1944, Franklin Roosevelt signed the GI Bill of Rights, which provided $500 a year for an education in an accredited college. This had a consequential effect on Catholic education, since about 30% of the enlisted men who fought in World War II were Catholics. After the war, many of these veterans wanted to attend a Catholic college, and the need for expansion quickly became evident. Later, these same veterans, supported by low-cost housing, started families, and the boomers, here's a few, thank you, and the boomers soon flooded schools, triggering even more need for expansion. When my father died, I noticed while going through his papers that I was born 9 months to the day of his honorable discharge. My mother said, "I was very glad to see your father." It must be something Celtic that you don't talk about sex, because there's none of it in The Lord of the Rings, and there was certainly none in our house we talked about. So those of us born in 1957 are the height of the boomers, and we soon flooded the schools of the United States. By the early 1950s, the transformation of the American mind that had begun during the Progressive Era in the United 50 years earlier, with its emphasis on efficiency and technology, had hit the American academia with full force. Although technology and science had yet to edge out the classics and the humanities as the primary degrees sought by students, by the beginning of the 1950s, education had begun a shift from its custodianship of the past to the navigators of the future. Although there had not been the full jettison of the humanities from the undergraduate experience, there certainly was a movement which placed an increased emphasis on what became known as the hard sciences. In addition to the effects of the GI Bill, another more ominous presence loomed on the eastern horizon during the 1950s. Whether or not Tolkien's moral geography had its counterpart in real life, the geographic East in the 1950s included the communist states of Russia and China. The fear of communism and its spread, aided by its growing success in technology, provoked even Catholic schools to lessen the Latin requirements and increase what became known as STEM courses. With the launching of Sputnik on October 4th, 1957, many faith-based and public schools saw communism as a far greater threat than students not knowing that Caesar had divided Gaul 3 ways. The little beeps of Sputnik emitted through the atmosphere in turn sent shockwaves through the United States, and even die-hard classic professors saw the need to replace Terrence for test tubes. Marquette was not immune to this trend, and the Jesuits led the charge, especially in the fields of engineering and broadcasting. However, true to their tradition, they kept up a strong emphasis on the humanities, which provided the foundation for philosophical and theological reflection, a holdover of what was called the Ratio Studiorum, which is a whole other lecture, which is actually important because it demonstrates why the humanities are so important. In fact, Jesuit schools were a sort of holdout to the trends that were in fashion by the beginning of the 20th century, which began to remove the humanities and philosophy from the standard course of studies. Jesuits, at least in the 1950s, attempted to balance what the ancient Greeks referred to as techne and episteme. The Jesuits argued that techne, or craft, was subservient to a greater general knowledge based on philosophical truths, known as episteme, that had their basis in the humanities. So you reflected, episteme reflected on the world of human experience in the humanities, and then you built up. This hierarchy, humanities first reflection, first a philosophical reflection on the humanities, and second a philosophical reflection, received substantial ridicule by many educators and scientists in the late 19th century, particularly a man by the name of Ernst Haeckel. Haeckel held to the principle of monism, which saw the world as only one mono-reality, that the world was only material and there was no spiritual dimension to the world. God, religion, and any notion of human freedom was tossed in favor of a material universe that followed the iron laws of nature. He saw any collection of knowledge that supported a notion of God that acted in the world as that dead learning from the Middle Ages. Although the Jesuits in their schools saw a need to embrace aspects of modernity, they saw that technology as a part of a wider picture that required governance by episteme, which embraced the fundamental relationships between the human person and God for the betterment of God's creation. To support this program, the Jesuits embraced what many refer to as the medieval synthesis, an idea that human society worked best when it fell in line with the divine dictates, when the city of man fell in line with the city of God. The cosmology portrayed by Dante captures this idea's best. Dante created a worldview for his famous Divine Comedy in which he neatly synthesized the physics of Aristotle, the cosmology of Ptolemy, and the theology of the day, which was a curious mix of Thomas and Augustine. In the Divine Comedy, the human person was situated in the center, like at the very top there where it says above purgatory. And the person was on a pilgrimage through life, or one could say an epic journey, moving from one condition to another, assailed by adversaries and aided by friends. For Dante, everyone was on a pilgrimage through life, and they had to make choices concerning their lives and their eventual salvation. According to the medieval mind, every man played the protagonist in his or her epic drama and pilgrimage through life. Considering this tradition for a respect for the humanities, and particularly a literature that had a moral voice in the light of technological advance and its consequences, the works of Tolkien attracted the eye of William B. Reddy, who was the director of the Marquette Library from 1956 to 1963. Part of his duties as director of the newly expanded library was to enhance the collection of Marquette by complementing its values and its curriculum, which supported strong programs in philosophy, literature, the humanities, and particularly medieval philosophy. It was part of a whole movement called the Gothic Revival, which is another story. Now, the circumstances of how Reddy got interested in the Tolkien manuscripts provides an interesting story, if not an insight into understanding Tolkien himself. While Reddy was still working at Stanford University, an English professor recommended The Hobbit as a good story to read as children. Reddy's interest in Tolkien began when he read The Hobbit as a bedtime story. In 1956, Reddy, who by this time had become director of the new Marquette Library, took an interest in the author of The Lord of the Rings. He requested that Tolkien make a visit to Marquette, and Tolkien agreed. 2 weeks before the ship was to sail, Tolkien canceled because of his wife's health. Reddy was a bit chagrined because he had orchestrated Tolkien to speak at Harvard and Berkeley as well. Tolkien was embarrassed as well, and according to Reddy's memoirs, Tolkien asked Reddy how he could make amends. Reddy suggested that Marquette purchase the manuscripts and related materials to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The deal was brokered through a bookseller in London, Bertram Rhoda, and in 1956, the deal was settled for $5,000. So this was not the only collection Reddy attained from Marquette that had some renown. Although not as famous as Tolkien among some circles, Reddy got the private papers and related materials of Dorothy Day, one of the co-founders of the Catholic Worker Movement, another collection that reflected Marquette's University of special interests. It would be helpful perhaps to note what Marquette has and what does not have in its collection. Marquette University holds the holographs, that's the handwritten, that's the things your professors can't read, typed versions, page proofs, and related documents to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Perhaps the most famous artwork held by the collection is Tolkien's watercolor drawing used by the publishers Allen and Unwin for the first edition of The Hobbit. There is some artwork that was drawn by Tolkien as marginalia, but the substantial amount of artwork and other literary works of Tolkien, including his personal papers, are held at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. So most of the illustrations we see are actually at the Bodleian. These drawings and watercolors have been the subject of several exhibitions and printed catalogs. In terms of understanding Tolkien, it would also be helpful to familiarize ourselves with his writings, which, like Caesar's Gaul, we can divide three ways. First, we identify his scholarly works, particularly his work on Old English and Middle English, and his research on the Beowulf epic. The second body of literature identifies that for which most persons have familiarity. His fictional works, which also include Leaf by Nigel, Farmer Giles of Ham, and other short stories, as well as a manuscript which he continued to modify throughout his life, the Silmarillion, which was completed and edited and published by his son, Christopher. The Silmarillion work poses several challenges for the Tolkien scholar because of its incomplete status, but complete enough to establish the background for his vast cosmology, for which Middle-earth was actually a very small part. The third group of literary materials are Tolkien's own correspondence and related notes. His letters have shed both light and a little confusion on how the second body of material, his fiction, should be understood. All Tolkien scholars have realized that any thorough investigation of the author of the century requires a knowledge of all three bodies of writing. You gotta know the scholarship, the fiction, and the letters. And that's a lot of work. It's immense. So that part of this immense body of Tolkien's work includes an artistic output as well, so the whole picture. And so part of this is at Marquette. So an upcoming Marquette, we're way off. Okay, all right, stop there. So from August 19th to December 12th, Marquette University will have a special collections. They will sponsor work for J.R. Tolkien. This exhibit will include over 100 works presented at the Hegarty Art Gallery on the university's campus. One of the works from the Bodleian will be there. The work will provide a fascinating combination of the original handwritten manuscripts, works of art themselves, alongside Tolkien's drawings and watercolors. If you go in September, you can get a bratwurst and you can go to a Brewers game. Okay, insights concerning Tolkien. So what possible insights can I give you this afternoon that may assist you in your reading and appreciation of the fictional works of Tolkien? I would like to call your attention to three facts that all intertwine and make for important points of reference to keep in mind when reading Tolkien's works of fiction, particularly The Lord of the Rings. These are, and not necessarily in order of importance, the fact that Tolkien was a Roman Catholic. He was a scholar and philologist of medieval literature and Old English, and perhaps most important all, he enjoyed telling bedtime stories. So, the first, Tolkien, the Roman Catholic. Go back. Okay. J.R. Tolkien was, to use an old-fashioned phrase, a devout Catholic. This is a fact, and a fact that caused some discussion between him and his new bride, Edith. Edith, who converted from the Episcopal faith to Catholicism, was not always happy with her husband's faith. The fact that Tolkien was a devout Catholic need not detain us here, And the tenacity of that, his strong Catholicism, served as a basis for the cooling of the relationship he had with C.S. Lewis. My interest here is what aspects of Catholicism will help us understand the mind and the works of Tolkien. So how can we, knowing that Tolkien is a Catholic, what in the Catholic mind will help us understand Tolkien? So generalizations come at great risks. And this is particularly true when it comes to discussions pertaining to religion. Noting exceptions, we may say of the Catholic faith that it embraces a community of believers that are very comfortable with what I call logical extensions of the truths of the faith. Let me explain. All Christians hold to what is commonly referred to as the articles of faith, the fundamental concepts of what is known by faith that have their foundation in that body of writing known as the Christian Scriptures. After the official acceptance of Christianity in the 4th century, when it was safe to stick your head out of your office in the forum, there was a profession of belief that you were allied with the person of Jesus. A council was held to define certain beliefs. This council was known as the Council of Nicaea, held in 325. One of the points of conversation, if conversation could be used to identify discussions that at times resembled an outright brawl, was the nature of Jesus. A full discussion of this council could take us well beyond the scope of this talk, but what the council decided on is what was called orthodoxein. Ortho means straight or correct, and doxein means to teach. So orthodox means correct teaching. Now, at this point, I would like to smack down some silliness that has been espoused by deists such as Thomas Paine and the popular authors of fiction such as Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code. All these have argued that the articles of the Christian faith are more the construction of a few than the lived experience from the earliest followers of Jesus. A study of the early Christianity does not support such a position. But why study history when you can write fiction and make money? Now, what I meant by logical progression can be seen in the text of the creed, that it is not taken from the Bible. So, for example, what we see in the creed, the Nicene Creed, and you know from your various literature, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, his only Son. Okay, the words in that are not, the ideas are taken from the Bible, but the phraseology itself is not. The composition of this document received approval and currently stands as one of the unifying documents of the Christian community. As the Christian community grew, it asked questions and drew conclusions, logical extensions from these truths. These logical extensions saw greater development in what is known as the 7 ecumenical councils. Now, these councils are important because they contain the articulations of what it means to be a Christian. And we use these councils as an example of how early Christian community performed logical extensions on the truths of faith. According to faith, it was held that Jesus was God. It was also held that Mary was the mother of Jesus. But that, some theologians argue, would make Mary the mother of God. The term mother of God, mater Dei in Latin, or in Koinonic Greek, Theotokos, the God-bearer, appears nowhere in Scriptures. Nowhere in the 4 Gospels and the epistles of John do you hear the phrase, Mother of God. And this, of course, raised all sorts of theological questions of whether God could have a mother. However, since Jesus was recognized at his conception as having both a divine and human nature in one person, Mary logically should be given the title of the Mother of God since she gave birth to Jesus in his divinity and humanity. The reality of this title was officially approved at the Council of Ephesus in 431. Other articulations of the original deposit of faith given by the apostles received similar treatment, and logical extensions of the truths of faith developed into beliefs held by the Christian community. What's interesting is the major Christian groups, Baptist, Episcopalian, Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, all hold to what is articulated in the first 7 ecumenical councils. Let me give you an idea of logical extension and what it is known by its proper name, theology. Theology is the logical extension of a first premise, a premise known by faith, which is arrived by faith. Let's do a little theology. Jesus died for all sinners. Tom from Robert is a sinner. Therefore, Jesus died for Tom. The first premise you know by faith. Then logically, you proceed. Therefore, let's compare this syllogism with something from physics. All bodies fall at 9.8 meters per second. A desk is a body. Therefore, this desk will fall at 9.8 meters per second squared. Now, the difference between these two syllogisms is not that one uses logic and the other does not. Rather, it is in the starting point established in the first premise of the syllogism. The first example has a first premise established by faith and the second by observation. But both proceed in a logical fashion. They proceed by logical extension. The word theologos means the logical reflection on God, or what is known by faith. And in theology, we draw logical conclusions from the first premise of faith. Now, if we want to look at one way in which Roman Catholics perhaps different from those from other Protestant traditions, one could say that Roman Catholics are more comfortable with making logical extensions built on the first premise of faith. It would be a grave error, however, to say that Protestants do not do logical extensions or do theology, since the evangelical community accepts the articulations of faith that are stated in the 7 ecumenical councils. Catholics, we can say, have a greater tradition, comfort in establishing logical extensions from the truths of faith. The perfect example of this logical extension, or theology, would be the Roman Catholic teachings concerning Mary, the Mother of God and the Mother of Jesus. If we take the line of thought on Catholic teaching on Mary, we can see how theologians begin with Scripture, move to the expressions articulated in the Council of Ephesus, and then continue to do theology on these truths based on the fact that Mary is the Mother of God, and moved into such doctrines as the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption. Now, this is no time to debate these doctrines held by Catholics. Rather, I mention them as an example of theological extension. And we recognize from a multitude of sources, particularly his letters, that this is the world that Tolkien grew, prospered, and heartily defended, especially with his friend C.S. Lewis. It is interesting to consider this rather organic development of doctrine and how this emphasis on organic growth and unity finds a complement in the artistic works of Tolkien. Tolkien embraced the artistic style known as the arts and crafts movement, which developed in England and made its way to the United States. Part of this movement came as a response against the effects of the Industrial Revolution, a revolution Tolkien held that placed an emphasis on mass production, uniformity, and degradation of the human person. The arts and crafts movement, which exerted a tremendous influence on Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, tended to follow nature and nature's realm, placing an emphasis on handcrafted work done in wood and metal. Here are some of the images of Tolkien's work compared with the master of the arts and crafts movement, William Morris. Okay, there's William Morris. Can you go to the next slide, too? And so you can see that's Morris's work, and that's the arts and crafts. So you can see this very organic sense that was part of the arts and crafts movement, but it's also part of the sort of organic development that we see in theology. Looking at these images, one almost feels, go to the next slide, too, there's another one there. One almost feels as if one is peeking into Bilbo Baggins's famous sitting room. The fact that much of Tolkien's artwork bears a strong resemblance to stained glass, with his pastel colors and simple shapes, is not coincidental. It was the art that he would have been familiar with in a Catholic church. When we describe something as organic, a term used both in the art of Tolkien and the arts and crafts movement, we imply a continuity, a growth. For Tolkien, the truths of the Catholic faith were organic, meaning that they grew from the deposit of faith that you saw in the gospel, and then continued to develop over time, much like a story. In the following quote, Tolkien compares the development of Catholic doctrine to the growth of a tree. Go to the next slide, too. There's another tree. This is token. My church, the Catholic Church, was not intended by our Lord to be static or remain in perpetual childhood, but to be a living organism, likened to a plant, which develops and changes in externals by the interaction of its bequeathed and divine history, the particular circumstances of the world in which it is set. For those living in the days of its branching growth, the tree is the thing. For the history of a living thing is part of its life, and the history of a divine thing is sacred. The wise may know that it began with a seed, but it is vain to try to dig the seed up, for it no longer exists. And the virtue and powers that now resided in the seed reside in the tree. So what Tolkien is pointing to is that this is part of this organic experience, the original deposit of faith, and then it grows, and trying to go back to the original seed, it's no longer there. The seed is the tree now, and you have to understand that whole organic growth. This takes us to the second important aspect of understanding Tolkien. He was a scholar of the Middle Ages. Now, from the start, we need to recognize that the very term Middle Ages is a derogatory term cooked up by a group of people that saw the 16th and 15th century Renaissance as the first, instead of giving credit to the revival of classical thought witnessed in the 9th century under Charlemagne and the 12th centuries at the universities and the cathedral schools in Europe. The Renaissance, as we know it, a phenomena, has been given the attribute as secular, particularly among 19th century historians who wanted to make the Renaissance the period when humanity shed its forged shackles forced on them by institutional religion. For our purposes, particularly those that touch upon literature, we need to look at the Middle Ages in a different way. Although the term Dark Ages in the past covered the years 5000 to 1500, called by 19th century historians 1,000 years without a bath, we know that such an identification is absolute folly. We can note that there was a shift in power and culture that occurred after the break of Charlemagne's empire around the year 900. This was not a demise, rather an incredible time when the barrier established by the Romans to limit the barbarians was firmly broken, and Europe emerged as perhaps an uneasy alliance between Germanic and Latin cultures. From this time, decentralized power, stories began to be told, influenced in part by the classic epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey and even the Aeneid, but also stories that had different vocabulary and a different worldview. Norse gods replaced the Olympian pantheon. We saw Thor replacing Zeus. And these stories are known to us by names: the Arthurian legends, the Ring of the Nibelungen, Beowulf, and the Norse poetic Edda. These stories began as oral narratives, and characteristic of oral discourse, change and embellishment was a logical extensive, since it enhanced and developed the story. In short, they grew like a tree. However, embellishment could not occur at the cost of the fundamental narrative, since that would disrupt the story. Like theological extension, the narrative of faith established extension so that the truth would be better understood in time and place. Here we may note that this movement that occurred from Europe's classical past and its movement in the Middle Ages was also the time and place for the development of derivative languages from Latin. We may note here an important phase in storytelling, and that it began as oral discourse and then only later became stationary with the ability of literacy and its wider practice. This stability hit full force with the invention of the press and the permanent status of how a story was told. This was a great advance for stability, but it was also the death sentence for the legitimacy of storytelling. And it's no surprise that this was also the time of the Reformations, when literal extensions of the beliefs of faith met their demise by such reformers as Erasmus. Erasmus had no time for the extensions established in the Middle Ages, particularly those that surrounded Mary, the mother of Jesus. In his famous colloquy, The Shipwreck, he ridiculed all those who appealed to Mary using the names and characteristics that were shaped in the oral traditions, such as Star of the Sea, Mirror of Justice, or Tower of Ivory. Incidentally, I wrote an article that demonstrates that all these names given to Mary that are present in a prayer that was formulated in the late Middle Ages, known as the Loretto Litany, are present and represent the character of Galadriel. For Erasmus, however, one stuck with the text, just the text, and nothing but the text. His insistence made for great accuracy, but it chilled the idea of elaborating the fundamental story so that the plot made greater sense to the listener. Much has been written describing the transformation concerning the transition from truth being moved from oral discourse to identified to the printed page. And now, more is being written about how changes are occurring to our process of retention and retelling of facts and how we access the truth, or what passes for the truth, that has been moved from the printed page to the computer screen. We can leave these discussions for the times, but for the moment, we want to recall that Tolkien was a student and a professor of stories of the Middle Ages, a time when stories that had their roots in primitive or simple narratives and then underwent various transitions, each transition capturing the essential story, but adding to it the images created by storytelling that eventually became the stories studied today. In short, stories in the Middle Ages were like trees. They were like theology. They grew from a seed, and then they were transformed to something different that was not the seed. J.R.R. Tolkien was comfortable in the Middle Ages, a world that saw a fundamental story as the starting point for the embellishments from an accomplished storyteller that could make the story alive to current listeners. Like theology, the logical extension of the truths of faith, the Middle Ages was a time when stories had their retelling, and this telling, their truths gained greater currency and developed as an organic growth. It is not surprising, then, that the stories surrounding Mary and the saints received their greatest embellishment in the Middle Ages. For example, I can say, from the Bible, Mary gave birth to Jesus. Mary was a person. Persons have parents. Well, let's give the parents names, Joachim and Anne. Well, Joachim had to do something, and they must have been good. So we can see how these stories sort of added to this kernel of faith that was in the Bible. Tolkien was at home in the tradition of the logical extension of theological truths known by faith as expressed in the Catholic faith, and he was equally at home in the Middle Ages, the repository of so many stories that developed, one could say even improved, with their telling. The fact that Tolkien was a storyteller then should come as no surprise. The third insight I offer in the way of understanding Tolkien. Tolkien heard stories from his father, and a quote from a letter sent to C.S. Lewis reiterated that point. And that's his parents, and I didn't have time to go into a Tolkien biography, which you can look into. But one of the better stories is the man in the upper right-hand corner took Tolkien away to his village to show him off. And the parents said, "Where's the baby?" And then you reappear, and they brought him back. And so anyway, he grew up in South Africa. Well, only spent a couple of years in South Africa. So here's a letter Tolkien sends to C.S. Lewis, talking his childhood. I was going for a stroll through the garden the other day when I began to reflect on my earliest memories of storytelling. Such wonderful memories I have of my youth. Memories of my father plopping me on his knee and then plopping me around his neck and then plopping me through the window, all while telling me the most fantastical tales I have ever heard. I must confess that I am still fascinated by the imaginative forces of these so-called children's stories. Ah, the power of the old tales. Truly, Lewis, that's what he called C.S. Lewis, there is a reason they have survived to this day. Tolkien understood why certain stories have survived, and he himself participated in the promoting of their survival. First, he knew that a story requires both a fundamental narrative that does not change, and second, it requires a bard's voice who brings that story to life. And to be a good bard, a good storyteller, a strong internal coherence is needed to support the world in which the story inhabits. The fact that Tolkien created his own world should come as no surprise. We see this in the world of Garrison Keillor's Lake Wobegon, Frank Baum's Land of Oz, or any player movie that creates a vast vision, such as the Star Wars series. Tolkien's world themselves stand as a vast and complex realm that pull equally from Catholic piety, medieval legend, and his own fertile imagination. For Tolkien, there was, however, one fundamental narrative, and that was the story of good versus evil and evil's abuse of power. And there is a force moving us towards that good that we can freely accept or reject. In this battle, the source of all goodness moves us towards that goodness which we are free to accept or reject. So what insights can we use to look at Tolkien? First, he was a Roman Catholic, a tradition that immerses itself with stories, perhaps some are exaggerated, some even a bit odd, but they were all created as attempts as a logical extension of the original story. Roman Catholics, Tolkien included, hold that these stories are logical growths from the seeds of faith and are nourished by faith. Hence, root, bark, and branch are one organic whole, and it could be appreciated as one vibrant and true reality. Thus, faith, for the Catholic, looks like one of the many trees that inhabit the land of Middle Earth. Any attempt, as Tolkien noted, to separate the kernel of the seed of faith from its logical extension as a story would be patently absurd. And I would argue that Tolkien saw trees as an image for the faith, and it is for this reason that killing of trees was one of the great crimes of Mordor, and the restoration of Hobbiton comes with the regrowing of trees. Trees, for Tolkien, were images of the Catholic project of extension or the growth of faith, the development of faith by means of a story. Thus, the great stories generated by the Christian and Catholic faith, especially of God's heroes, the saints, that received verbal and visual embellishment, especially in the Middle Ages, are not only stories of faith, but what makes that faith alive and survive. Second, Tolkien was a scholar of the Middle Ages, at the time when stories flourished and they had yet fallen victim to the printing press and the petrification of print. As a professor, he taught and valued that the dissemination of knowledge that came from the living oral discourse of telling stories, this living nature had no small consequence on his art, which moved like nature across the page. And third, Tolkien himself embraced both these worlds of Catholicism and the Middle Ages, becoming what he loved, a storyteller. In this, Tolkien stands in the tradition of the great bards by once again providing our human community with its greatest gift of keeping alive the power of the old tales. In Tolkien, once again, we hear the story told that it is important to work towards the good, avoid the lust of power, and never miss a second breakfast. Thank you. Now, the field of this is quite large, and I'd love to either answer a question. Being a Jesuit, I may not give you the right answer, but I'd like to answer questions. or we can promote a discussion on some of the topics that you'd like to bring up. So, what do you got?
Let me add that for them to be able to hear you on the streaming video, you're going to have to put your question into the microphone. So if anybody
And that's a microphone, not a chicken leg. Oh, am I going to get it?
Are you prepared to drive yourself to the Atlanta airport, is all I have to say. Anybody have a comment, a question?
Now yes, please, go back there.
Wonderful.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. Thank you for coming. I wondered what Tolkien thought of Vatican II, and could The Lord of the Rings be seen as part of the same project of taking the Catholic Church's message and making it presentable to
Well, that's an interesting question.
to a wide audience?
Yes, and that's two questions. So the first is, what did Tolkien think of the Second Vatican Council? So, let me just preface this very quickly. What's the Second Vatican Council? Basically what happened by 1955, people had realized that Darwinian socialism wasn't going to cut it, and that a new worldview was needed. For example, the UN document on the document on human rights, that there had to be a new worldview, that the survival of the fittest wasn't going to cut it. So the Catholic Church comes forward and says, we got something to offer. Except what they realized was that a lot of the world now was Asian, African, Indian, or modern, and the vocabulary over here didn't fit the vocabulary that was needed. So there was this change of, basically. Tolkien writes, and this is actually where I got the tree quote, is he wasn't happy with this idea of going back to the sources. The Vatican Council, and the man that led the charge, who, if you're Roman Catholic today, is his feast date, John the 23rd, said he had two things. He said, ad fontes, which means you go back to the documents, and then you bring them forward so they can be understood. So it's a dialogue between sources and making them acceptable to understand. Tolkien felt that there was this return that sort of negated the organic growth of the church, i.e., by going back to the primitivism, it's like you're looking for the seed. The seed's gone. The tree is there. And he felt that this was the Protestantization by cutting off all the seed business. And if you read reformers, they're all accusing, where does it say in the Bible you got Joachim and Anne? And where does it say all this stuff? Cut it off. Well, Tolkien didn't like that. Tolkien liked that, what I call logical extension. So in a way, he did like the ecumenism of reaching out to Christians. He didn't like the lobbing off of that organic growth. So he was very much, he liked his Latin Mass. I can explain later. But he liked it, not that he was staid, but he very much saw this organic growth. And it's interesting, Tolkien grew up in this area in architecture. It's called the Gothic Revival. You got all those churches like, American Gothic, like that. And the Gothic period, if you look at inside of a Gothic cathedral, it's like one unified, it's all tied together. And that's what that organic sense is what Tolkien saw. And I could go on, and that he saw Mordor and all this as this disruption of the movement of the earth to God, that very Thomistic view. So he liked some of it, he didn't like the cutting. I want to hear from the English professor.
Would you rather I kept walking? I was wondering if you would recite for us a little bit about that passage about Galadriel being compared to that litany up there.
Sure, I can flesh that out a little bit. In Roman Catholic devotion, there is a prayer, and it's called the Loretto Litany. And it is a prayer, a litany, maybe you've heard them, it's a short phrase, and then you answer, if you're old, ora pro nobis, or if you're young, you'd say, pray for us. So you say, Francis, pray for us. Pope John, pray for us. St. Michael, pray for us. St. Gabriel, pray for us. And you have to remember that much of Catholic tradition is based on orality because people couldn't read, okay? So this prayer that was said along with the rosary were these names that were given to Mary, that many of them were found in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. And this was a big thing. The theologians would look to the Hebrew Scriptures and then see complements. And so these titles were Turris Eburnia, Tower of Ivory, Arca Fedorum, Ark of the Covenant, House of Gold, Conciliar Spes Nostrae, Our Faith. Okay. Well, oddly enough, I'm reading all this, and I realized that these names of Mary, House of Gold, Counselor of the Afflicted, Source of Hope, Mirror of Justice, were all characteristics of Galadriel. This sort of points to sort of this debate that goes on among Tolkien scholarship. Did he take from pagan medieval sources, or did he take from Christian sources? Well, if you can find me a pagan medieval source, good luck. I mean, it's very much on a spectrum. And so it's really a false question that this imagery, so this is a case where, now clearly, so this is a case in Galadriel, and it's interesting. Elfish is based on Hebrew, and Galadriel, the El is not like an El Shaddai or Emmanuel, meaning God. It means, Galadriel in Hebrew means tall, smooth skin, like Turris Eburnia, Tower of Ivory. And of course, she has them. So you can go through all these we call it appellations or characterizations of Mary that are in this prayer, and you can just tick them off and you can see them in the character of Galadriel. I wrote an article on it. Of course, Jesuits were always writing articles. Any other questions here? Yes, please.
Well, I had a question about Tolkien and the symbolism in trees. Because as I was sitting here looking at this, I just realized from the party tree to Sam planting the tree at the end, every tree in the middle, not to mention the Ents, right? The trees are quite a symbol that's used frequently in there, from the trees at the gates of Moria to the whole of Lothlorien. So what do you think Tolkien had in mind when he used trees as symbols?
I think trees very much, for Tolkien, were an image of this idea of organic growth. For Tolkien, that civilization comes in a focus, and later on in this letter, and if you email me, I'll send, he said, trees are like our faith. They start with a seed and they grow, and then a good arborist will cut away things that aren't helpful. But this growth is the thing. That's why, back to your question, he had no tolerance for what he called primitivism, trying to go back to the original church. He said, it's dead, it's gone, it's like looking for a seed in a tree. And so for Tolkien, a tree is this organic entity that seeks its natural end. And it grows, and it does good things for others, but itself and it grows. And I think this organic growth, that it imitates, in a way, theology. Was my big point, that theology is the organic extension of a seed. So, for example, in the Bible, we have Mary as the mother of Jesus, and then 500 years later, we got the Immaculate Conception. How did that happen? Well, Tolkien would say, just like a tree. And that's why he saw the cutting of trees. It's the cutting of the story. And for Tolkien, the maturation of the story is where we both become human and understand humanity. And it's for this reason, and she didn't pay me, is why the humanities are so important. It's the importance of the skill of storytelling. In the storytelling, we hold the tradition, we mature the tradition, we continue the tradition. And that is what's being lost. By cutting the humanities, we're cutting the trees. And if I can, that's not that I like preaching or anything, but I can tell you that that it's the teeming horde from Mordor that comes to want to cut the skills of writing and learning and good literature. And that I tell you, students, you may think, why do I have to take this literature? Why do I have to write compositions? This, Tolkien would argue, is what carries civilization. And then by telling the right stories, that's how we understand the correct use of technology. Anybody else here? Oh, we got there. Oh, here, then come. Oh, heaven's sakes, don't. I don't want to keep you here.
So I was curious about something I had heard through the C.S. Lewis Tolkien discussion about the true myth, where Tolkien explains to C.S. Lewis this idea of all myths of the past are pointing back to the truth of Scripture, imperfectly but surely. And so I wasn't sure if that you had any commentary on that kind of connection where it's looking to myth and seeing the echoes of the one true faith, so to speak.
What we have to understand is the word myth. We mistake the word for, what do they do? Oh. We mistake the idea of myth as something that is not true. A myth is something that has truth, but there is both the truth and the story that encapsulates the truth. Let me use let me use an example from scriptures. If I asked you the story of the prodigal son, would you say that is true or false? Well, you'd say it's a story about God's love for all creation. Whether the son's hair was blonde or brown is not essential to the truth. So for Tolkien, the story, the essential story is God's intentional creation of humanity to do good, humanity's disruption of that intentional will of God, and then the return back to that original intention. So, for example, if you're a fan of now the Silmarillion, it talks about making this creation, the rejection and all that. But that, for him, is the fundamental theological core. Creation, rejection, return. Okay. It's interesting, just as a little point here, I could go on. Remember that slide I showed you of Dante? Okay. And the humanity is in the middle, and either you can go down or you can go up. When you go to Rome, always say when, never say if. I teach in Rome too. Is the middle of the Sistine Chapel. Do you know what picture is in the middle of the Sistine Chapel? Anybody know? Anybody take a guess? No! The creation of Eve. That is the most important thing. Why? Well, what did Eve do? She caused the whole mess. Ain't it, like a woman? Ain't it the truth? Okay. Now stay with me, ladies. Eve's first name in Latin is Eva. What's the first thing the angel says to Mary? How do you say hi in Latin? Ave, which is flipped around of Eva. And so what one woman did, another woman, Eve disobeyed, Mary obeys. And so the center of the Sistine Chapel is either you're going to be like Eve and go back over to the altar, the original creation of the world, or you're going to go to the other end, which is the drunkenness of Noah. And so that's the myth. It's this idea that every human person goes through an epic, and you have to do what's good. Now, the other thing that I didn't have time to talk about, for Tolkien, the only way we really make it is by divine inspiration. Because at the end, Frodo, plot spoiler, but I think most of you know, can't throw the ring in. Yet because he was merciful by saving Gollum, Gollum ends up taking the ring and falling in for him. So at the end, his human bravery and action is not enough. And so Tolkien says that this return only occurs by divine inspiration and grace. And the tricky thing is, what is the relationship between our effort and God's participation in that effort? And that's a whole nother, anyway, I think but that's the primal myth. That's what, and of course, Beowulf is a struggle. So all this, and Tolkien very much sees in medieval literature this initial creation and then the struggle. If people need to go, don't worry. As long as you leave money in the collection plate, not just yes.
So you've mentioned the Thomistic Revival a couple times.
The what?
The Thomistic Revival?
Yes.
How does that tie in with 19th century nationalist movement?
How does this revive? The Thomistic Revival was, Thomas Aquinas was very much someone that saw that in the movement towards God, we start with nature, and then we move to this more theological state. For example, in his famous 5 proofs for the existence of God, he says, let's pretend God never existed, which is kind of radical for the Dominican in the 13th century. He said, let's just look at motion. Let's look at the world, and from the world, let's build, to an understanding of God. Part of the Thomistic Revival had to do with education. That first you did the humanities, and you understood. Now back then, here, pay attention. The humanities, we make this mistake, we call arts and sciences. Big mistake. The humanities were science. It was the trivium and the quadrivium, which included science. It was what was the particulars of human knowledge. Then philosophy reflected on human knowledge and came up with philosophical truths. So like, for example, you'd say, biology, what's good for a frog, and botany, what's good for a chrysanthemum. And then philosophy would argue, what is good? And then theology argued, what do we know by revelation that supports what we know by truth? So there was a very clear movement. The humanities, philosophy, theology. And that sort of organic growth that was started by Leo XIII, or he revived it in an encyclical called Aeterni Patris in 1885. And that was this organic growth. And it's interesting, we see it in the Gothic Revival, the architecture of a Gothic church. It's all one unified system. And C.S. Lewis he was right there, of course, Thomas is, and of course what's fascinating is, where did universities come from? That organic growth, that synthesis. And so that was an important aspect of Tolkien's life. Any other? Carol, there's
I have a little bit of a silly question. What's your opinion on Thorin from The Hobbit, like his character?
Thor?
Thorin.
Oh, the dwarf.
Yes.
Well, boy, I'd have to quote the book, not the movie. What are the dwarfs in the song? I can't answer. That's Thorin Oakenshield, correct? Kind of belligerent, but he converts at the end. Kind of, doesn't die. Oh, no, I can't, boy, you stumped me. That's pretty good, because normally it's been a long time since I read The Hobbit. The Hobbit is the story about the Lord of the Rings is interesting because Tolkien will say, I'm writing The Hobbit, but I feel like there's something always pushing me. There's something not that he didn't have. He was doing all these primal stories, so this is written for the children, and then after he reflects on this, because The Hobbit was about 15 years prior to the final publication of the Lord of the Rings, and so it's hard, I don't know it. I know the Baith, but no, Thor I can't. The individual characters, it's been a long time since I read The Hobbit. Did you back here? You got a. Boy, this is great. Have more talks on Tolkien. Yes, please.
Well, since you mentioned religion, I was wondering what would be the religious connection to the multiple races in Lord of the Rings trilogy. And
The what? The multiple races?
yeah, was there any religious connection there?
Oh, you should have me over for another. Guess what? The multiple races because you're talking about dwarves, men, elves, the Valar, and all that, and multiple is that it's interesting, and this goes back on, is that basically in the Tolkien mind, all things are in God's worldview, okay? And that in this, though, for Tolkien, and this maybe comes from his other literature as well, there is, this is sort of this predominance of men, because men have this special, the human person, have this special aspect of creation. And so men are not so much that they're better, but they have this role in Middle-earth, which becomes an analogy for our world. As Tolkien said, this is our world. And so the Valar, the elves, they're in another world that's theirs. So it's not so much a difference. But for Tolkien, I do know is that he was very much horrified by eugenics and racism, because he saw this dissolution of this commonness of the human venture, that the common humanity of man was very important. But for Tolkien, read A.T. Son's commentary on St. Aquinas and the Angels. Just kidding. You have trouble sleeping? But what the commentary was on Tolkien was that God makes various aspects of creation like the angels, but they have their worlds. This is our world, and that in our world we're all one human race. So there was not a priority of the races. There was difference, but if you notice, it's interesting. Like, for example, at the inn at Bree, he talks about where hobbits and men mingled, but they tended to keep to their own natural order, but it would be incorrect to read into it a type of segregation, that, you know, there were levels in society. What Tolkien wants to talk about is a reflection of the book of Genesis, that this world, the world we know, is for the human person. And there may be other worlds, but this is for us, but we treated each other commonly. Well, as my father would say, Mama, go to bed. Let's go. These people want to go home. So again, thank you very much, and thank you. You've made me feel very welcome here, and thank you for this opportunity. Come to Milwaukee.